I know it will be hard when I have the baby and they take it from me. I think about it almost every night.
Women's prisons have unique challenges and dangers. This video shows the 10 most dangerous female prisons in the world. It talks about the tough conditions and treatment of the inmates. We want to expose the negative aspects of prisons. Patarei prison in Estonia used to be a fortress and then became a high-security prison. It held men and women prisoners until 2002 when it closed. The prison is on our list due to its bad conditions and dark past. The cells were overcrowded and damp, which made prisoners vulnerable to diseases and infestations. The Patarei prisoners were treated inhumanly by brutal guards. Inmates often experienced physical and psychological abuse, causing lasting trauma. Medical care was scarce, causing many prisoners to die from untreated illnesses or injuries. Patarei prison has had many cases of human rights violations. As a Soviet prison, many people were executed, tortured, and forced to work there. After the Soviet Union, the prison was still in bad shape. The old building and bad living conditions made things worse for the prisoners. Female prisoners at Patarei were sexually abused and harassed by male guards and inmates. Mixing male and female prisoners made things worse. Women were more likely to be hurt or used. Patarei prison is a symbol of human rights abuses, even though it's closed. The prison is now a museum and memorial site that shows visitors its difficult past and the suffering of the prisoners. Women at Patarei prison suffered. We need to improve prisons and protect human rights. Bangkok Hilton is a prison in Thailand for male and female inmates. This prison's nickname suggests luxury, but it's not glamorous. Bangkok Hilton is a very dangerous prison, known for its bad conditions, harsh treatment of prisoners, and strict rules. Bangkok Hilton has poor living conditions due to overcrowding. Prisoners are in small, dirty cells, and some sleep on the floor because there aren't enough beds. There are bugs and rats in the cells, and the bathrooms are not good, which makes many prisoners sick. Women in Bangkok Hilton prison face dangers like sexual abuse and exploitation. Men and guards often harm women in prison because they are not separated properly. Female inmates often undergo invasive strip searches and other degrading treatment that can harm their mental health. Prisoners at Bangkok Hilton don't get enough medical care and are sometimes not treated properly. Inmates often don't get medical treatment and can get very sick or die. Also, being in solitary confinement for a long time can harm prisoners' mental health. Food at Bangkok Hilton is not enough and not good. Inmates often suffer from malnutrition, making them weak and prone to sickness. Prison corruption can lead to only wealthy inmates getting food and medicine. Bangkok Hilton is a very dangerous female prison. The terrible conditions and mistreatment make it a living hell for the inmates. The women in Bangkok Hilton show why we need to improve prisons and protect human rights everywhere. Vanho Women's Prison in Egypt is known for its terrible conditions and mistreatment of female inmates. The prison is very harsh and dangerous for women. Vanho Women's Prison is overcrowded and has poor living conditions. Prisoners share small, dirty cells with poor ventilation and sanitation. Poor hygiene in prisons can spread diseases and harm women's health. Female prisoners at Vanho Women's Prison face abuse and mistreatment. Prison guards often abuse inmates physically and mentally by beating and humiliating them. Women at Vanho Women's Prison have reported sexual assault and harassment by guards and other inmates. Prison medical care is not good enough, so inmates get sick or hurt without treatment. Poor health care harms prisoners' physical and mental health. Pregnant women and people with chronic health conditions are at higher risk here. The prison punishes even small mistakes with severe penalties like isolation and violence. This harsh discipline harms inmates' mental health, causing them to feel hopeless, sad, and worried. Prisons are corrupt. People who pay bribes get food and medicine. This makes the inmates' living conditions worse and adds to their suffering. Ravensbrück concentration camp was a place where female prisoners were treated brutally and inhumanely. Ravensbrück women's stories show the need for prison reform and human rights protection for all inmates, regardless of gender. Santa Marta Acatitla is a women's prison in Mexico City, known for being unsafe and corrupt. The prison has a bad reputation for mistreating inmates and violating human rights, making it one of the most dangerous women's prisons globally. Women in prison need protection and reform. Santa Marta Acatitla is overcrowded and inmates live in unsanitary conditions. Poor ventilation and hygiene spread diseases. Limited clean water and nutritious food make prisoners sick. Prisoners often experience physical and mental abuse from guards and other inmates. Women in prison are often sexually assaulted and harassed, causing lasting trauma and fear. Also, the prison administration's inaction has made the offenders more confident. Medical care at Santa Marta Acatitla is not good. Many inmates are sick or injured and not getting treatment. Poor health care in prisons is dangerous for both physical and mental health of prisoners. Pregnant women and people with chronic health conditions are more vulnerable in this situation. Santa Marta Acatitla prison has a lot of corruption. Inmates have to pay bribes to get food, medicine, and hygiene items. Corruption makes living conditions worse and reduces trust in prison administration. The prison's strict discipline, like long periods of being alone and physical punishment, harms inmates' mental health. Prisoners often feel hopeless due to despair, depression, and anxiety. Santa Marta Acatitla shows how bad things can be for female prisoners in some parts of the world. Women in prison need better protection and human rights, just like everyone else. This shows why we need to reform prisons. El Buen Pastor is a big prison for women in Bogota, Colombia. It's known for being very bad because of how the prisoners are treated and how violent and corrupt it is. This prison is one of the most dangerous for women due to its harsh environment. Women at El Buen Pastor face struggles that highlight the need for prison reform and human rights protection. El Buen Pastor is overcrowded, with almost twice as many prisoners as it was designed for. Prisoners live in small and dirty spaces without enough air and clean bathrooms. Poor hygiene spreads diseases and pests, risking prisoners' health. Prisoners often face violence from guards and other inmates. Women in prison are often sexually assaulted and harassed, which causes lasting trauma and a constant fear. The prison's failure to fix these problems makes violence and abuse continue. El Buen Pastor has poor medical care, causing inmates to suffer from untreated illnesses and injuries. Lack of health care harms prisoners' physical and mental health. Pregnant women and people with chronic health conditions are at higher risk here. El Buen Pastor prison system is corrupt. Inmates have to pay bribes for basic needs like food, medicine, and hygiene items. Corruption makes living conditions worse and reduces trust in prison administration. The prison's strict punishments, like long periods of being alone and physical harm, hurt the mental health of prisoners. Prisoners often feel hopeless due to despair, depression, and anxiety. El Buen Pastor shows how female prisoners can suffer from terrible conditions and mistreatment in some parts of the world. Women in prison need better rights and reform. Ravensbrück was a big concentration camp for women in Germany during World War II. The Nazis ran it from 1939 to 1945. It's an old prison, but still very dangerous for women. That's why it's on the list. The women at Ravensbrück suffered terrible cruelty. We must make sure it never happens again. Ravensbrück had terrible living conditions with overcrowding and filth. Prisoners were crowded in dirty barracks with poor ventilation, and the absence of hygiene facilities caused diseases to spread quickly. Poor food caused malnutrition and made prisoners more likely to get sick. Nazi guards at Ravensbrück often physically and mentally abused inmates through beatings, torture, and humiliation. Women prisoners were sexually assaulted and made to work as prostitutes at the camp's brothel. Thousands of women were used for medical experiments, including sterilization and surgeries without anesthesia. The inmates at Ravensbrück received poor medical care. Prisoners who were sick or injured were not given treatment, and many died. The camp's hospital was a place where many inmates died due to poor conditions or euthanasia. At Ravensbrück, prisoners were forced to work hard for long hours to make goods for the Nazi war effort. People who were tired, hungry, or sick were often killed or sent to extermination camps. Ravensbrück concentration camp is a reminder of the cruelty of the Holocaust. We must always remember the women who suffered and died in this place. It reminds us to protect human rights and prevent such terrible things from happening again. Valley State Prison for Women, USA. VSPW in Chowchilla, California used to be the biggest women's prison in the U.S. But in 2013, it became a men's prison. VSPW was a women's prison known for being dangerous and abusive towards inmates. It had scandals and was eventually converted. Women at VSPW need prison reform and human rights protection. VSPW was overcrowded and inmates lived in cramped and unsanitary conditions. Poor hygiene and pests spread diseases in prisons. Poor food and water caused health problems for prisoners. There was a lot of violence and abuse at VSPW. Prisoners were often mistreated by guards and other inmates. Sexual assault and harassment were common in prison and often not addressed by the administration. VSPW's unfriendly atmosphere caused inmates to experience anxiety, depression, and self-harm. VSPW had poor medical care, and many prisoners were sick or injured without treatment. Lack of health care harmed inmates' physical and mental health. Pregnant women and people with chronic health issues were at high risk in this situation. VSPW had scandals and mistreatment of inmates, so it closed as a women's prison in 2011. The prison was sterilizing female inmates without their consent, which caused public outrage and demands for change. VSPW became a men's prison in 2013, and the female inmates were moved to other prisons in the state. Valley State Prison for Women shows how female prisoners can face danger and abuse in the U.S. Women at VSPW need prison reform and human rights protection like all inmates. Female prison in Median, Indonesia. Median female prison in Indonesia is infamous for its harsh conditions, mistreatment of inmates, and violence. The prison is one of the most dangerous female prisons due to its reputation for abuse. Women's prison stories. Median female prison shows the importance of prison reform and protecting human rights. Median female prison is overcrowded with too many inmates. Prisoners live in small, dirty spaces with poor air and hygiene. Poor hygiene spreads diseases and harms women's health. Prisoners often experience violence from guards and other inmates. Women in prison are often sexually assaulted and harassed, which causes lasting trauma and fear. The prison administration not fixing these problems makes violence and abuse continue. Medical care at Median female prison is not good enough, and many inmates are sick or injured without treatment. Poor health care in prisons is dangerous for both physical and mental health of prisoners. Pregnant women and people with chronic health issues are at risk here. The Median female prison has corruption. Inmates need to pay bribes for basic things like food, medicine, and hygiene items. Corruption makes living conditions worse and reduces trust in prison administration. The prison's strict punishments like long periods of being alone and physical harm hurt the mental health of prisoners. Prisoners often feel hopeless due to despair, depression, and anxiety. Median female prison shows how bad conditions and mistreatment can happen to female prisoners in some places. Women in prison need better rights and protection. This shows we need to change prisons.